the quiet coast. Long before highways stretched across the countryside, and long before cities glowed through the night, there was a peaceful stretch of coastline where the sea seemed to breathe in slow, gentle rhythms. The waves rolled toward the shore without hurry, as if time itself had decided to rest there. Standing on a lonely cliff was an old lighthouse. Its white stone walls had been softened by countless seasons of wind, rain, and salt from the ocean. Every evening, just as the last golden light disappeared beyond the horizon, the great lantern at its top would awaken, sending a warm beam across the dark water. The villagers often said something curious about the lighthouse. It never sleeps. No one could explain exactly why they believed this. Perhaps it was because the light had guided sailors safely home for generations. Perhaps it was because even on the quietest nights, when no ships crossed the sea, the lantern continued its silent watch. An elderly keeper named Elias cared for the lighthouse. His hair had turned silver many years ago, and his footsteps were slow, yet steady. Every sunset he climbed the winding staircase, carrying a small lantern although he hardly needed it anymore. He knew every stone, every creaking step, every window that overlooked the endless sea. Elias never rushed. He believed that everything important in life moves slowly: the tides, the stars, the changing seasons, and the human heart. Each evening he polished the great lens until it sparkled like crystal. He checked every gear, every bolt, every tiny mechanism that allowed the great light to turn gracefully through the darkness. Outside, seabirds settled onto the cliffs. The wind became softer. The sea whispered its endless song. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another peaceful night quietly began. The morning after the tide. Morning arrived without announcing itself. The first light of dawn gently painted the horizon in soft shades of pale blue and warm gold. The ocean looked like smooth glass, quietly reflecting the waking sky. Tiny waves touched the shore with such delicate rhythm that they sounded more like breathing than water. Elias had already been awake for hours. He believed the world was at its most honest before everyone else had opened their eyes. With a steaming cup of herbal tea in his hands, he stood outside the lighthouse, watching a small group of gulls glide effortlessly above the sea. The cool morning breeze carried the scent of salt, pine trees, and wildflowers growing along the cliffs. Everything felt exactly as it should. Every morning followed a peaceful routine. Elias would slowly walk along the narrow path beside the cliff, greeting the old fishing boats resting in the harbor below. Sometimes he exchanged a friendly wave with the fishermen preparing for another quiet day on the water. No one was ever in a hurry here. The village had learned long ago that the sea could not be rushed, and neither could life. As Elias returned toward the lighthouse, he noticed something unusual resting on a weathered wooden bench near the entrance. It was a small leather-bound journal. The cover had faded with age, and tiny grains of sand clung to its edges, as though it had traveled a very long way before arriving there. There was no name. No date. Only a simple symbol pressed into the leather: a tiny lighthouse surrounded by stars. Elias gently picked it up. He brushed away the sand and smiled quietly. Some stories, he thought, do not find people by accident. Perhaps this little journal had been waiting patiently for years until someone was ready to read it. He carried it inside, placing it carefully beside the large window overlooking the peaceful sea. Outside, the waves continued their endless conversation with the shore. Inside, the old lighthouse remained warm, silent, and full of quiet possibilities. Without realizing it, Elias was about to begin a journey that had started long before he was born. The Journal of Quiet Tides. The little journal rested on the wooden table beside the window, where the morning sunlight gently warmed its worn leather cover. Elias did not open it right away. He believed that every old object carried its own quiet story, and stories should never be rushed. Instead, he prepared breakfast as he always did: a slice of fresh bread, a little honey gathered from the village beekeeper, and another cup of warm herbal tea. Outside, the sea continued its endless rhythm, as steady as a heartbeat. Only after breakfast did he return to the journal. Its pages were thick and slightly yellowed with age. The scent of old paper mixed with the fresh ocean air drifting through the open window. It felt less like reading a book and more like opening a forgotten memory. The first page contained only a single sentence. If this journal has found you, perhaps the sea believes you are ready to listen. Elias smiled softly. It was an unusual way to begin a story, but somehow it felt comforting rather than mysterious. As he turned the next page, he found gentle observations instead of dramatic adventures. The writer described quiet mornings when dolphins appeared in the distance. They wrote about clouds that resembled sailing ships. They noticed how every season painted the lighthouse in different colors: golden summers, silver winters, emerald springs, and crimson autumn evenings. Each page reminded the reader to slow down, to notice the wind, to hear the birds, to appreciate the comforting sound of waves meeting the shore. Hours passed almost unnoticed. The sunlight slowly crossed the wooden floor, and shadows stretched gently across the room. For the first time in many years, Elias realized he had spent an entire morning doing nothing except reading and listening. Not to voices, not to noise, but to the peaceful silence surrounding him. As evening approached, he carefully closed the journal and placed it back beside the window. Outside, the lighthouse lantern prepared for another quiet night. Inside, Elias felt something he had not experienced in a long time. A quiet sense of wonder. And somehow, he knew the journal still had many more stories waiting to be shared. The music of the wind. That evening, the lighthouse shone as faithfully as it always had. Its warm beam swept slowly across the quiet sea, reaching far beyond the horizon where the sky and ocean gently became one. Inside, Elias sat near the window, the old journal resting on his lap. He had planned to read only one more page before bed. But the wind had other plans. It arrived softly, slipping through the tiny gaps around the lighthouse windows. Instead of a whistle or a howl, it carried a gentle melody, so faint that Elias wondered if he had imagined it. He closed the journal and listened. The sound wasn't music in the usual sense. It was the quiet harmony of nature itself. Waves brushing against the rocks. Seabirds settling into their nests. The wooden beams of the lighthouse creaking with age. Even the turning lantern above seemed to add its own slow rhythm. Together, they formed a peaceful song that had likely been playing for hundreds of years. Elias smiled. When people rush, he whispered to himself, they miss the music that has always been there. The thought stayed with him long after the melody faded. Before going to sleep, he climbed the spiral staircase one final time to check the great lantern. Everything was working perfectly. The enormous glass lens reflected tiny stars that had begun appearing across the night sky. Looking out over the ocean, Elias noticed something beautiful. The sea was glowing. Not brightly, but softly, as though thousands of tiny blue stars had drifted beneath the surface. Every gentle wave shimmered with delicate light, turning the dark water into a peaceful blanket of sparkling blue. He had seen this before. Tiny living creatures in the sea, glowing whenever the water moved. Nature's own quiet lanterns. For several minutes, Elias simply stood there, watching the glowing tide roll slowly toward the shore. There was no need to hurry. Some moments become unforgettable only because we allow ourselves enough time to notice them. As midnight quietly settled over the coastline, the lighthouse continued its endless watch, while the wind carried its gentle song across the sleeping sea. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another page of the mysterious journal was waiting for tomorrow. The visitor with no footsteps. The following morning arrived wrapped in a gentle blanket of silver mist. The lighthouse stood quietly above the cliffs, its white stone walls softened by the cool morning air. From the highest window, Elias watched the sea disappear and reappear beneath the drifting fog, as though the ocean itself were breathing slowly in its sleep. He carried the old journal outside and settled onto the weathered wooden bench near the lighthouse door. There was something peaceful about reading beneath the open sky. As he opened the journal, another simple sentence greeted him. Sometimes the kindest visitors leave no footprints behind. Elias paused. He looked around. The narrow path leading to the lighthouse was empty. No fisherman had climbed the hill that morning. No travelers had wandered near the cliffs. Only the quiet sound of distant waves filled the air. He smiled and continued reading. The journal spoke of visitors who could never be seen with the eyes alone. The first rays of sunrise warming cold stones. A gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine trees from distant forests. The quiet arrival of a robin singing outside the window. The comforting silence that appears just before dawn. The writer believed these were the world's gentlest visitors. They arrived without asking for attention. They stayed only for a little while. Yet they always left behind a feeling of peace. As Elias lifted his eyes from the page, a small red-breasted robin landed softly on the wooden fence beside him. It tilted its tiny head as if curious about the old keeper and his mysterious book. For several quiet moments, neither of them moved. The bird simply sang its delicate morning song. Elias listened with a grateful smile. When the robin finally spread its wings and disappeared into the mist, the silence somehow felt even more beautiful than before. He gently closed the journal. Perhaps, he thought, happiness was never something that arrived all at once. Perhaps it came quietly. One peaceful moment at a time. Above him, the lighthouse stood strong against the changing seasons, while below, the sea continued its endless conversation with the shore. And somewhere beyond the soft morning fog, another quiet lesson was already waiting to be discovered. The stars that remembered. That evening, the mist had disappeared, leaving behind one of the clearest skies Elias had seen in many years. As the sun slowly slipped below the horizon, the first stars appeared one by one, scattered across the heavens like tiny lanterns. Soon, thousands of them filled the night, their gentle light reflected upon the calm sea until it became difficult to tell where the ocean ended and the sky began. After lighting the great beacon, Elias climbed onto the lighthouse balcony with the old journal tucked beneath his arm. He opened it carefully. The next page held only a few quiet words. The stars remember every traveler who ever looked up with hope. Elias gazed toward the sky. He imagined sailors from centuries ago crossing these very waters, guided only by the stars above and the lighthouse behind him. Some were returning home after long journeys. Others were setting sail toward places they had never seen before. Yet every one of them had paused, if only for a moment, to look upward. The stars had watched them all. Generation after generation. Storm after storm. Season after season. Without speaking a single word. A cool breeze drifted across the balcony, carrying the scent of saltwater and distant pine forests. Somewhere below, gentle waves rolled against the rocks with their familiar rhythm, never hurried, never late. Elias closed his eyes and listened. The sea. The wind. The turning lantern. The quiet heartbeat of the night. Everything seemed connected, moving together in perfect harmony. He realized that perhaps people searched too hard for extraordinary moments, while the greatest treasures had always been waiting in ordinary evenings like this one. Above him, a single shooting star crossed the dark sky, disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. Elias smiled, not because he had made a wish, but because he had been present enough to notice it. The lighthouse continued sending its warm circle of light across the sleeping sea, while countless stars kept their silent watch overhead. And in the quiet pages of the old journal, another gentle lesson was already waiting for tomorrow's dawn. The secret garden on the cliff. The next morning arrived with a soft golden glow, as though the sun had decided to rise a little more gently than usual. A light breeze carried the fresh scent of wild lavender and sea salt across the cliffs. The waves below whispered their familiar song, while tiny white clouds drifted lazily across the bright blue sky. After finishing his morning tea, Elias decided to explore a narrow path he had not walked in many years. The path curved quietly around the far side of the lighthouse, hidden behind tall grasses and smooth gray rocks shaped by countless seasons of wind and rain. As he rounded the bend, he stopped. Before him lay a small garden. It wasn't grand or carefully designed. In fact, it looked as though nature herself had been tending it for decades. Wildflowers bloomed in every direction: lavender, daisies, tiny bluebells, and soft yellow buttercups swayed gently in the morning breeze. Butterflies floated from flower to flower, while busy honeybees hummed peacefully through the warm air. At the center of the garden stood a weathered wooden bench, almost hidden beneath climbing roses. It seemed like a place where time had quietly decided to rest. Elias sat down and opened the journal. Today's page read, "Every heart needs a quiet place where no one asks it to hurry." He looked around the little garden. No clocks. No voices. No footsteps. Only birds singing in the distance, the gentle movement of flowers in the breeze, and the endless rhythm of the sea below the cliffs. For a long while, he simply watched a butterfly dancing from blossom to blossom. It never seemed worried about where it was going. It simply trusted the wind. Elias smiled. Perhaps peace was not something hidden in faraway places. Perhaps it had always been waiting in quiet corners of the world, patiently, unnoticed, until someone finally slowed down enough to discover it. As the afternoon sunlight warmed the garden, the lighthouse stood proudly above the cliffs, watching over both the sea and its tiny hidden sanctuary. And somewhere inside the old journal, another peaceful chapter patiently waited for the next sunrise. The boat that returned with the dawn. The night passed as gently as a whispered lullaby. High above the cliffs, the lighthouse sent its faithful beam across the sleeping sea, turning slowly through the darkness as it had done for countless years. Elias rested peacefully, knowing the great light would continue its quiet duty until morning. Just before sunrise, he awoke to a sound he had not heard in many days. The soft creak of wooden oars. Curious, he climbed to the highest balcony of the lighthouse and looked toward the harbor below. Through the pale blue light of dawn, he spotted a small wooden fishing boat gliding silently across the calm water. There was no rush. No loud engine. Only the steady rhythm of the oars dipping into the sea. An elderly fisherman sat alone, smiling gently as he guided his little boat toward home. A few white seagulls circled above him, while the first golden rays of sunlight painted the ocean with ribbons of amber and silver. Elias watched quietly. The scene reminded him that not every journey was measured by distance. Some journeys were measured by peace. When the fisherman reached the shore, he looked up toward the lighthouse and lifted one hand in a silent greeting. Elias returned the gesture with a warm smile. No words were needed. Some friendships are built through years of quiet understanding rather than conversation. Later that morning, Elias opened the journal once again. The next page contained another simple thought. The happiest travelers are not always those who go the farthest, but those who truly notice the road beneath their feet. He closed the journal for a moment and looked out across the endless sea. The lighthouse had never traveled. It had stood in one place through every sunrise, every storm, and every season. Yet somehow, it had witnessed more journeys than anyone else. As gentle waves continued rolling toward the shore, Elias realized that perhaps life's greatest adventures were not about constantly searching for somewhere new. Sometimes, the deepest sense of wonder could be found by quietly appreciating where you already are. And as the morning breeze carried the scent of sultan wildflowers across the cliffs, another peaceful day began beneath the watchful light of the lighthouse. The moon's gentle letter. That evening, the world seemed quieter than ever before. The sea rested beneath a sky of deep velvet blue, where a full moon rose slowly above the horizon. Its silver light stretched across the calm water like a peaceful pathway, inviting the eye to wander into the distance. Elias finished lighting the great lantern and carried the old journal to his favorite chair beside the round window. The lighthouse was warm and still. Only the gentle turning of the great lens and the soft crackle of the fireplace filled the room. He opened the journal. On the next page, he found another quiet message. The moon never hurries across the sky, yet it always arrives exactly when it should. Elias read the sentence twice. Then he closed the journal for a moment and looked outside. The moon climbed patiently, never racing, never stopping. Its reflection danced softly upon the water, broken only by the smallest waves rolling toward the shore. He thought about how people often wished life would move faster or slower, depending on the day. But the moon never wished to be anywhere else. It simply followed its quiet path. A family of seals appeared on the rocks below the lighthouse, resting peacefully beneath the moonlight. Far out at sea, a lonely sailboat drifted silently, its white sail glowing softly against the night. The entire coastline seemed wrapped in a blanket of calm. Elias poured himself another cup of warm chamomile tea and sat without reading another page. For once, the silence itself felt like enough. He listened to the waves. He watched the stars. He breathed slowly with the rhythm of the sea. The lighthouse continued its steady circle of light, faithfully guiding anyone who might still be sailing in the night. As midnight quietly settled over the coast, Elias smiled to himself. Perhaps peace was not something to search for. Perhaps it had been beside him all along, in every sunrise, every wave, every quiet breeze, and every moonlit evening he had taken the time to notice. Outside, the moon continued its silent journey across the heavens, while the lighthouse kept its timeless promise to the sea. And tomorrow, another page of the old journal would gently reveal itself with the coming dawn. The morning of quiet goodbyes. The first light of morning arrived almost unnoticed. A soft golden glow spread across the horizon, gently replacing the deep blues of the night. The lighthouse stood peacefully above the cliffs, its lantern now resting after another faithful night of guiding distant travelers home. Elias opened the windows and welcomed the cool ocean breeze into the old stone tower. The air carried the familiar scent of salt, wildflowers, and pine trees. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. And somehow, that made it extraordinary. He picked up the old journal once more. The leather cover had grown even softer with time, as though every page had absorbed a little of the sea, the wind, and the quiet mornings spent beside the window. He turned to the next page. There were only a few simple words. Every peaceful ending is quietly becoming a beautiful beginning. Elias smiled. He understood now. The journal had never been trying to teach him grand lessons. Instead, it had gently reminded him of things he had always known but had sometimes forgotten. To pause before speaking. To watch the sunrise without checking the time. To listen to birds instead of noise. To enjoy a warm cup of tea while the rain tapped softly against the windows. To appreciate the people, places, and quiet moments that often passed unnoticed. He carefully closed the journal and placed it back on the wooden shelf near the round window. He no longer felt the need to read another page. The lighthouse itself had become the next chapter. Outside, the fishing boats drifted peacefully across the calm sea. Children laughed in the distant village. Seagulls floated effortlessly on the morning wind. The waves continued their endless conversation with the shore. Life moved forward, just as it always had. Not quickly. Not slowly. Simply, beautifully. As Elias stepped outside into the warm morning sunlight, he looked once more toward the endless horizon. The lighthouse would continue shining. The sea would continue singing. The stars would always return. And anyone who chose to slow down, breathe deeply, and truly notice the world would always find their way home, not only across the ocean, but within themselves. The old lighthouse never slept. Because hope never sleeps. The keeper who became the sea. Days turned into weeks, and weeks quietly melted into seasons. The lighthouse remained exactly where it had always been, standing tall on the cliffs, watching over the endless sea. But something inside Elias had slowly begun to change. He still woke up before sunrise. He still checked the lantern every evening. He still walked the familiar paths along the cliffside, greeting the wind, the birds, and the waves as if they were old friends. But now, he no longer felt like he was simply taking care of the lighthouse. It felt as if the lighthouse was also taking care of him. One quiet afternoon, Elias stood at the edge of the cliffs, watching the ocean stretch far beyond the horizon. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The wind moved gently through his silver hair, carrying with it the scent of salt and distant storms that never quite arrived. He opened the old journal for what he felt might be the last time. The pages had become familiar now, like the face of a lifelong friend. But the final page was different. There were no more messages. No more sentences. Only a soft blank space waiting to be understood. Elias closed the journal slowly. For the first time, he felt that the story was no longer coming from the book. It was coming from everything around him. The turning of the lighthouse beam. The slow rise and fall of the tide. the distant cry of seagulls disappearing into the sky. The steady heartbeat of the sea itself. That evening, as the sun began to set, Elias did something he had never done before. He did not light the lantern. He simply stood beside it and waited. But the lighthouse did not go dark. Because it had never truly depended on one man alone. It had always belonged to something larger. To the wind. To the stars. To the ocean. To time itself. As night arrived, the beam of light continued its slow, endless circle, steady, patient, eternal. And Elias finally understood. He had not been the keeper of the lighthouse. He had only been a temporary guest in its endless story. When he looked out across the darkening sea, he no longer felt separate from it. He felt part of it. As if every wave had once been a thought. Every breeze had once been a breath. Every star had once been a memory. And in that quiet realization, Elias smiled softly into the night. Because the lighthouse was not a place. It was a feeling. And that feeling would never sleep. The light that became forever. The night was calm in a way that felt almost sacred. No waves crashed loudly. No wind howled through the cliffs. Even the stars above seemed to shine a little softer, as if they too were listening. The lighthouse stood as it always had, tall, patient, eternal. Its light turned slowly across the sea, drawing a gentle circle of gold over the dark water. Elias stood outside one last time. He did not carry the journal. He did not carry anything at all. Only the silence of a long life spent in the company of the sea. He walked slowly to the edge of the cliff, where the land met the endless ocean. The air was cool and quiet, filled with the familiar scent of salt and thyme. Behind him, the lighthouse continued its endless duty. In front of him, the sea waited without asking for anything in return. Elias closed his eyes. For a moment, he remembered everything. The first page of the journal. The robin in the mist. The glowing blue waves. The silent fisherman at dawn. The moonlit reflections on endless water. Every small, quiet moment that had once felt ordinary, now felt infinite. When he opened his eyes again, something had changed. Not the world. But the way he saw it. He no longer felt like someone standing beside the ocean. He felt like part of it. As if the lighthouse, the sea, the wind, and even the stars had always been different voices of the same great silence. Slowly, Elias turned back. But there was no farewell. Because nothing true ever leaves. It only changes form. As the final hour of the night passed, the lighthouse beam continued its gentle rotation across the horizon. No one was there to turn it off. And no one needed to. Because the light was no longer just in a tower of stone. It was in the memory of every sailor who had ever found their way home. In every quiet heart that had ever paused to breathe. In every listener who had ever stopped long enough to notice the world. And somewhere far beyond the sea, beyond time, beyond endings, the lighthouse still shone. Not as a place. Not as a man. But as a feeling that never sleeps. And so the story does not end. It simply becomes part of every night that follows. Good night.